So my name is Stoyan Sgourev. I'm a professor of management at ESSEC Business School, sociologist by education. Well, these are wonderful questions. I've never thought about it that way. You know, it's interesting because I've written about both. I've written about categories and then periphery and core and periphery, but I've never thought about the connection between the two because they're generally different frameworks, different perspectives. You know, the core and periphery is very structural. You know, it's basically structural social science, structural scholarship, and it's kind of a different paradigm in the sense that, you know, if you look at, for example, the work of Gino Catani, Simone Feriani, you know, the classic org science, and Damon Phillips as well. I mean, we're kind of people that within sociology or organizational sciences, I mean, we probably make the most use of the core periphery language. But we've never established a connection to categories, and I agree that, you know, it's interesting because it is a category by itself. You know, core and periphery, I mean, that's a categorical distinction. Right. But we've never discussed it in those terms. So I thought this is a really, I don't have an answer to the question actually, to be perfectly honest with you. Yeah. But it is very interesting, you know, and especially for me, the real challenge is the more dynamic aspect of this, and how do you move between the two, and then I mean, this is something, especially in the analysis of core and periphery, I think it's, for me, the biggest challenge is, you know, explaining how things happen all the time, because there are cycles as well. You know, for me, there are cycles, you know, and I'm more interested not in the movement of people, but I'm more interested in the movement of ideas. You know, that's somewhere that I'm kind of different from other colleagues, because I'm not that interested in the actor by himself or herself, the individual actor, but I'm interested in how ideas move, you know, between core and periphery, and I have this idea of escalation, that the ideas essentially, very often they originate from one part of the social structure, but then they get developed in another part. So you can actually have the case when ideas originate in the periphery, but then they're escalated in the core. But for me, the really interesting process is when ideas originate from the center and then they're escalated at the periphery, because I think this is the kind of the process that is recurrent in the history of art, and I'm very interested in the history of art, and I see this over and over again in the history of art. You know, you have this kind of process of escalation of ideas. The contrary is basically the way that we think in general about innovation as a process is that, I mean, there's a tendency for this, is that innovation is some radical innovation happens in the periphery, and then it's kind of tempered. You know, it's modified and moderated on the way to the core. Okay, I mean, because of the demands of the market, because of the need to kind of format and frame the idea so that you can sell it better. So the way that we think in general about innovation is moderation. You know, so ideas, they would kind of start off in the periphery, but then they would get moderated and eventually commercialized. You know, and they would get commercialized in tempered radicals. You know, that kind of idea. This is the typical way we think about innovation, and I think this is right. But there's also another process, kind of the opposite process, and for me that's kind of the escalation, when ideas originate from the center, but they cannot be developed in the center because of the center. There are a lot of constraints. There's also accountability, and I think, you know, for radical ideas, you need a certain level of. You need a lack of accountability to the market, to audiences, because otherwise, you know, ideas would be tempered. Right. So for ideas to escalate, I think, you know, that's easier to happen on the margins. So very often, in the history of art at least, you know, you will see cases when kind of ideas circulate and they will be picked up by artists in rather distant locations, and then, you know, they will escalate. Think about audiences. I think think it's not very different from opera than other industries, but it takes time for people to warm up to really new things. You know, more often than not, I mean, the new forms of culture rejected. You know, I mean, in opera, if you stage a completely new production, it's very likely that you'll lose money on it. It's almost guaranteed, actually. So if you're actually doing this, this means that if you're losing money on that production, you have to compensate for it by staging Aida, Verdi, Puccini, things that really sell.
Right.
And that's what I found. You know, they're looking for that equilibrium. You know, the kind of the. I mean, you can understand it from a managerial and organizational perspective. The question is it good for the art itself? Because that's the big question. And I think you see it in science too, because it's difficult to come up with things that are radically different and to offer new paradigms and have it accepted. And it's a huge challenge. It's very risky. And generally, especially for PhD students, the proclivities to do something, you know, that is incremental innovation, because the chance of acceptance is higher. But then naturally the question is, well, is it good for science? And that's something that I think there's no agreement on this. It was, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's a bit different in the sense that when I became an assistant professor, I think this is when I kind of assumed the most risk by going into the arts, because it was not. And now it's more of an established field, rather than, you know. But 10 years later, when I started working on the Cubism paper, obviously, I mean, it was very risky. It was not easy to get it published. But it showed to people that, you know, you can do organizational science in a different way, and still it's meaningful and it's interesting, and really anything, you know, can give you the opportunity to develop ideas that are relevant and frameworks that have a broad relevance. So yeah, it's I had a great time working on that paper. I mean, yes, the research is personally relevant in the sense, you know, I pick things that are kind of resonate with me, but things that I find interesting. I mean, the story behind that paper. I mean, I think in science, very often, I mean, there's a lot of serendipity in the sense, you know, that the way you pick subjects, it's not so hasty, obviously, but there is a certain level of randomness. And when I was at MIT, it just so happened that there was a book sale, and I picked up this book on Cubism for $5. You know, I'm a poor graduate student. And that turned out to be one of the most important books in Cubism.